Hi there, welcome to the channel. My name is Marty, and today I will make these paintings using a combination of gouache and watercolor. Today I want to talk about two very popular mediums and what happens when you mix them. Many people have asked me over the years if watercolor and gouache can be mixed, and the short answer is yes. You can absolutely mix these two awesome types of paint. So today I'll demonstrate and discuss how you can mix them, why you should consider mixing them more often, and what are the applications you can apply when mixing them. Let's start here with a pencil sketch and a gouache underpainting. I'll do all the initial work in gouache here, and then I'll apply some transparent watercolor a little later. But just as a reminder, gouache is a mostly opaque painting medium, but that can vary greatly depending on how much or how little you dilute the paint with water. An underpainting like the one I did here can be used to warm or cool your overall painting. I'm using a toned paper today, but you could apply an underpainting to any decent watercolor or mixed media paper. Let's take a quick break to look at how to mix gouache and watercolor and why you might want to do it. That's a red, that's a yellow, a blue, and a green. These are all gouache on the bottom and they're all watercolor on the top. I tried to use similar colors as much as I could. And then I'm just going to add this gouache to this wet paper towel. It's a tip I learned from James Gurney. If you wet the towel, then your gouache paints will stay a little bit moister longer. I'll use some of this fluid watercolor paper. It's pretty inexpensive, but it works great. And I like it a lot, so it's fine for this. If you feel like, well, I wondered about this, but I didn't know who to ask. You're not the first person, definitely, to ask about how to mix watercolor and gouache. And of course, this is just one idea or set of ideas about how you could do that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some gouache in various diluted forms. So first in thick, then a little bit thinner, and then finally even thinner than that, more watered down. So just to kind of give you an idea, that gouache can run a range from very opaque to transparent, almost as transparent as really transparent watercolors. It depends on how much you water down the gouache. Now, it's still going to be a flat paint, but you can get some transparency from gouache. And it, of course, depends on the colors you use and how much water you add, but obviously you can do it. Now, some watercolor here, just going over the line to show you that watercolor can also be opaque or transparent depending on what you do to it. So if you lay it on really thick, transparent watercolor will tend to be transparent, but there's a trick to making it more opaque if you want to. I'll talk about that in a minute. So what I'm going to do here first is mix a couple of paints. So I'll mix the gouache, which is on the left-hand side, with my watercolor that's on the right-hand side. So I'm just mixing it up here in this ceramic tray. And I'm going to mix different colors to get unique colors here. So adding a little bit of blue to that red gouache there, and that's a transparent blue in watercolor, but it's going to come out flat. The watercolor, well, I should say the gouache is going to dominate the watercolor a little bit because there's a little bit more gouache here than watercolor. And that's also going to make a difference of whether or not this is a warm or cool mixture. This happens to be a little bit of a warmer mixture, but as I water it down, you can see it does get more and more transparent. And yet a strange thing happens when it dries. It will be flat even if it's transparent. So it will look flat, but it won't be as opaque as straight gouache. There's a lot of reasons to mix gouache and watercolor if you want to directly mix the two. Maybe you want to just vary that opacity or the transparency a little bit in a painting. But one of the things that is done a lot with gouache and watercolor is a technique called glazing, which I'm going to talk about more in depth here and demonstrate throughout the video. But you can actually use watercolor on top of gouache or vice versa, depending on the effect you want to get. So here I'm going to use, remember earlier I said there's a little trick to making transparent watercolors more opaque. I'm just going to add a little bit of zinc white here. You can either add zinc white watercolor or zinc white gouache. It doesn't much matter for these purposes. But what I want to show you is that if you add a little bit of that zinc white to a color, like a transparent color like this ultramarine blue here, and you mix it up a little bit, you're going to be able to get a more opaque uh, transparent watercolor. So this is going to change the color a little bit, obviously, and I'll go back and add a little bit more blue later, but you can see here that you're getting a more opaque transparent watercolor by adding a little bit of zinc white. You could also add a little titanium white. Zinc just leaves it a bit brighter. Now here's an example of just using gouache, this yellow cadmium gouache, and then I'm going to do some things over this gouache to kind of illustrate the glazing technique. But I just kind of wanted to show you up on top that you can get a transparency from the gouache even though it's gouache, which is meant to be more opaque. So it just depends on the amount of water mixture you want. So here's a gouache, and that's a cadmium yellow, and I'm just going to add a little bit of the blue transparent watercolor over it, and you can see it's turned green. So because a little bit of that gouache yellow, quite a bit of it actually, is coming through the transparency. Same with this green and red here. You can see it's changing colors as I go over the green, but it still has that transparency there. And exactly the same thing with the transparent red over the blue. I'm getting a nice purple there, but you can see the blue is coming through. Now you could do many layers on top of that if you wanted to. Just have to make sure that the paint is dry between layers and work a little quickly. Be very decisive when you do that, because otherwise, if you tend to scrub the paint, it'll pick up the paint underneath it and you'll end up with a watercolor rather than the glazing effect, which is what you want to add a little luminosity to the painting. So here, just mixing down a little bit of this red, adding a little white to make it more opaque. I don't like the color of that pink, so I'm just going to add a little bit more red right into that and get the reddish color going. But that's a transparent red, and I just added a little bit of that zinc white as an example here to show you how you can make a transparent color, a watercolor, more opaque. So can you paint like gouache just using watercolor and adding some zinc white and mixing it right? Well, you can get some opacity, but remember that watercolors are mostly a transparent media. So if you really want to get that opacity, it's best to use gouache. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this too much, but again, you can get opacity with transparent watercolors by adding a little bit of white, and then maybe you have to add a little bit more color in there to get it right. But you can also do the same by diluting gouache with a little bit of water. You get more transparency from the gouache. They're both water-based media. The thing that you'll notice with the gouache is though the paint will be much more flat. Now here I'm just cleaning up this green square a little bit with some white gouache. It picked up some of the watercolor paint because it wasn't quite dry or I was too wet with my brush. So I'll wait for that to dry and go over it again. And now let's get back to the demo. Now, just to be in a good habit here, I want to let my gouache underpainting dry thoroughly before I add any additional paint. This will be especially critical when I go to add watercolors. I diluted my underpainting with water so it just colors the paper a little darker and warmer. I don't need much more than that for this small sketch. For the greens here, I'm going to mix a little bit of hooker's green, sap green, and to lighten it just a little bit, I'll use some titanium white. I'm just going to say on this particular little sketch that my light source in this composition is left to right, meaning I'll want to lighten the right side of these trees wherever they aren't in shadow. I can also use a little Payne's gray to enhance the shadows when I get to that point in the painting. Today I'll do several of these little sketches, so if you miss something initially here, don't worry, because I'm going to follow the same pattern on each of the paintings. One of the things I want to do here when I'm painting a tree or just about anything in gouache where I've got light and shadow involved is I want to push my darks a little darker and my lights a little lighter, at least initially. Now, when I get to the watercolor portion of this, which will be in a little while, I'll want to make sure that everything is, again, thoroughly dry before I go to add the watercolor in. There's no rule saying you can't mix watercolor and gouache right in your palette. But one of the things that you do when you directly paint and mix on your palette is that you kind of lose a little bit of the properties of both of them. So for gouache, you want that opaque flat look. And for watercolor, you want more of that transparent look. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can enhance the two and join them together without actually mixing on the palette. But that said, you can definitely mix on the palette, and I do it sometimes as well. It's a fun thing to experiment with, and it's great to try new things. So go ahead and try that if you get a chance. It's fun to do that. Here, I'm just going to paint the background sky around the trees because I've already got those in. And you can see that my overall sketch is a little warmer because I warmed it up with that underpainting at first. And even though the gouache is opaque, it has enough transparency that a little bit of that warmth comes through, especially on the edge of the trees. At this point, I'm going to mix some transparent watercolors as long as the gouache is thoroughly dry, and I work relatively quickly with the watercolor. I can avoid reactivating the gouache underneath, making things muddy. So if I sat and scrubbed it, it would muddy the colors and blend them together, and I don't want that. What I want to do is use a technique called glazing. This is a technique often used in oil paint. And to glaze with oil paint, you apply a very dry, opaque underpainting, then use a soft brush to apply thin, transparent layers of paint over it, allowing each layer to dry completely before adding the next. That technique, both in oil painting and watercolors, helps to create a depth and kind of a glow to your paintings. So you could actually glaze with gouache, although it's a little bit more difficult because it is made to be an opaque paint. So you might find that you struggle or might have more challenges doing that because you'll have to dilute the paint between glazing or layering. But with transparent watercolors, glazing becomes easier right over the top of the dried and opaque gouache paint. So just to reduce confusion, when a person that's painting or an artist, or you go into school and they say, we're going to do some glazing today, what they really mean is they're just going to layer on paint. So don't be confused by the art term glazing, but that's what it means when people refer to glazing. And again, the technique can be used in a wide variety of medium. But basically, when it comes down to it, it's basically layering the paint. Now, the technique or key here is to just apply those layers while the layers beneath are thoroughly dry. Again, especially with gouache, which is a water-based medium, it will reactivate if you scrub it enough or, soak it with water. So then you end up with a muddy looking painting, and you want to keep those colors and layers as sharp as possible. If you add a little bit of the sky color to the trees, to the center of the trees, or somewhere on the trees now and then, it gives the effect of having the background sky coming through the trees and branches, which you'll often note through observation if you're out in the field just looking at the trees. The sun is going to come through, or the light is going to come through behind the trees and shine through. So don't forget that when you're doing painting. So here's what I'm doing here to add a little shadow is this is a little Payne's gray, but I did warm it up a little bit with a little bit of red, but it's so minor, so minuscule that you can't really even detect it, but it's a little bit warmer. And then before I start glazing out, again, want to make sure, or glazing or layering paint or mixing watercolor onto this painting, I want to make sure that everything is thoroughly dry. So I'm kind of moving between the two here just to make sure everything's dried out. Well, there's lots of good reasons why you might want to mix gouache and watercolor, especially glazing when you want to add depth or luminescence to your paintings. Or maybe you want to make your watercolor just a little bit more opaque. You could add a little zinc white or titanium white to the color. You can also add texture with gouache. It goes on thick and it'll leave marks like oil paints. You can also highlight with it and correct errors using gouache. Now I'm going to use a little bit of watercolor, but what I've done here is I've also mixed in a little bit of yellow and a little bit of titanium white there for those trees just to highlight the light. And I'll come back over that again once that's dry. Here, just painting some animals in the field. I'll go ahead and clean those up later as well. Again, just whenever I'm doing these little paintings, I'm just blocking in large shapes at first. And then I'll add the detail as the painting comes along. So maybe some telephone poles here along the road and maybe a fence to keep the cows in. So add a little shadow to the side of that silo. There's a little tiny reflected light coming off that barn, but not going to worry too much about that right now. I didn't want to paint in the lines just yet, so I just use a little pencil here to kind of work that detail in. And now I can begin to work on the field a little bit. So now I've got the watercolor again here, and I'm going to mix a little bit just to lighten up this green. It's a little darker than I want it. Then I'm going to warm it up a bit too with a little bit of this red, kind of the sunlight hitting those trees. Just a warm light. And now I'm glazing right over or layering right over the dried gouache paint. And since this is a mostly transparent watercolor application, you're going to be able to see some of that come through, some of that underlying local color from the layer beneath coming through that glazing, which gives it that sort of luminosity that you want to get, or a little bit of depth anyway. This is not an overly complicated sketch or anything like that. So, yeah, I'm just really for simplification's sake trying to break it down into one or two layers. I'm not adding, 17 or 18 glazes, which you could definitely do even in a little painting like this, but there's no rules saying you couldn't add 10 or 12 or however many glazes you want. As long as you don't muddy up the painting, you're fine. And just let things dry. Be patient. And if you're not patient, you can always just go get a hair dryer and, dry the painting, accelerate the drying process yourself if you're impatient to wait. Now, that doesn't really work on an oil painting, but what does work on an oil painting to dry between layers is to add a little bit more mineral spirits to your paint, and that'll help it dry out a little quicker if you're an oil painter or if you like to paint in oils. Now, for the gouache and watercolor direct mixing in the palette, I did a little bit of that on that painting on the left just to get the right combination of transparency and opaqueness I wanted. But there's really um, not a ton of compelling reason to mix those two together right in the same, like mixing two greens together, one gouache and one transparent watercolor, because then you just come out with a more opaque transparent watercolor, really. So, but I don't find that as, I don't find as much utility in that as I do in just being able to glaze over gouache with transparent watercolor. However, I will say this, just add this one last thing onto that. If you want to glaze first with the gouache, you can do it. You just have to dilute the gouache down a little bit between layers. So just dilute a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until you get kind of a transparent gouache. So, and if you want to get things more opaque in a transparent watercolor, you can always add a little bit of zinc or titanium white, because as soon as you add those color, as soon as you add white to almost any color in watercolors, it's going to get more opaque. So I wanted to add a little highlight to each one of these little posts, like a little light reflecting off of it. And this is just a little bit too bright, this white here. So I'll knock that down in a minute. But yeah, it didn't quite work out the way I wanted it to. It just does look like kind of like reflectors or lights on top of each post. So I just wanted to knock that down. So I use a little tissue to take that down a notch or two. So add a little dark over here on this edge, a little bit of shadow. Actually, I've got it messed up here, but there's actually light hitting that area, but it's okay that the road's deep enough that there might be a little bit of a cast shadow from the foliage at the edge of that road. But I would do that a little different if I did the painting over again. Here, I just want to clean up some edges here and add a little bit more of this blue. And there's some random, yeah, stuff like that hanging out there, and I just want to get rid of that. So I've got the gouache again, but it's pretty diluted. This time I added a little bit of zinc white. That's just going to brighten things up a little bit and make the sky background just a little bit more opaque. Just remember what I said about adding titanium white or zinc white or any kind of white gouache to your colors. It's going to make them a little bit flatter and more opaque. And I just need to spread this out a little bit so it's a little bit more uniform throughout the painting. There isn't a ton more I want to do to these. Again, these are just little sketches. I used a little bit of that yellow ochre just for the ground in front of those three trees above. Now here I'm using some zinc white for the clouds. Just kind of adding those in. They don't have to be, you don't have to make them look like puffy, rolls of cotton or anything like that. Oftentimes, the more you try to do with this guy, the less it will end up looking like clouds. Like many things in art, less is oftentimes more. So that's really it for these three little paintings. I think I'll just leave them here. I kind of like the way they turned out, and it just kind of highlights how you can use transparent watercolors over gouache and do some glazing techniques to help enhance or change up your drawings a little bit and your paintings. I had fun doing this, and I hope it helped give you some ideas or at least a little technique you can use next time you're using gouache and you want to combine it with watercolors. Thanks for tuning in today. This is Marty for owingsart.com. We'll see you next time.